Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in this room that was airtight, carefully monitoring their oxygen intake so that this gas didn't kill them, since the gas that they were experimenting with was very toxic in high doses. So they had to keep a very close eye on them. Now keep in mind, they didn't have the tech for cameras to be inside the room, so they had only microphones and a 5-inch thick round glass looking inside this room. The chamber or room was stocked with books, cots to sleep on, but no bedding, and they did have running water and toilets and enough dried food to last the 5 subjects that were inside this room for over a month. The end result was truly terrifying. Hi, I'm Zach, and welcome to Rooted Expeditions. If you're a fan of the abandoned, historical, and strange events and locations, then you are in the right place. Hit that thumbs up and let's dive into today's strange event. Due to some graphic content, viewer discretion is advised. Sometime in the 1940s, Russian scientists used 5 test subjects for a sleep experiment. These test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything seemed to be going fairly well for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, and this was probably because they had been falsely promised they would be released after this test, which they would have to not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored very closely, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past life, and their general tone of their conversation took on a darker aspect after their 4th day. After 5 days, they started to complain about their circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and they started to demonstrate severe paranoia. Then they stopped talking to each other and began whispering in the microphones that were inside the room, and they would look at the one-way windows looking into the room, and they would whisper to who they thought was on the other side. Then they all seemed to think that they could win the trust of the researchers by turning over their fellow soldiers, which were the same subjects that were in captivity with them in that room. At first, the researchers suspected that this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days in the experiment, one of the subjects started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. And after 3 hours, he tried to continue screaming but was only able to make a soft scream due to the fact that this man had physically torn his vocal cords from screaming so much. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other prisoners in this room reacted to it, or rather didn't react to it. It is as if this man screaming for 3 hours back and forth didn't even faze them. They continued whispering to the microphones until a second guy in the room started to scream, while 2 other men who weren't screaming took their books apart that were in the room and ripped the pages out and smeared their feces on them, calmly pasted them over the glass windows. So now the researchers can't even see inside this room because it is covered up with this feces and paper. Then after a while, the screaming just stopped, and so did the whispering. After 3 more days passed, on the 12th day, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, because it became pretty quiet in the room, and they thought with 5 people being in that room, they should be able to hear them through the microphones. When researchers checked the oxygen consumption levels in the room, it indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, what was strange was that the consumption level of the oxygen was consistent to 5 people performing extensive exercises. Now keep in mind, these one-way windows were covered up with their feces and paper, so they still couldn't see inside the room. They could only know what was going inside the room by the microphones. On the morning of the 14th day, not much interaction was happening inside the room, so the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the prisoners inside. They used the intercom that was inside the room, hoping to get some type of response from the 5 men inside, since they couldn't see inside that room. They wanted to make sure that they were not dead. They announced,
"We are opening the room to test the microphone. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom."
What came next, they were not expecting. they heard a single phrase in a calm voice response saying, "We no longer want to be freed." As the researchers went back and forth on whether they should open this door or not, they decided to open the airtight door to the room around midnight on the 15th day. But just before they opened the door, they had to clear the room of the gas so that they could enter in the room. So they cleared the room of the gas and replaced it with fresh air. Then immediately voices from the microphones began to come through, begging, as if pleading for their life of loved ones to turn the gas back on. The chamber door opened and soldiers were sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder and louder, and when the soldiers walked in the room, they started to scream as well. 4 of the 5 test subjects were still alive, although no one could really call the state that any of them was in. They noticed that the food rations had only been touched for the past 5 days. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chest stuffed into the drain in the center of this chamber or this room, which doing this blocked the drain and allowed 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. To tell how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn from their bodies. Goodness gracious, crazy. Okay, moving on. The destruction of the flesh and exposed bones on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand and not with teeth as the researchers initially thought it was. Closer examination of the position and angles of their wounds indicated that they were self-inflicting wounds. Their bodies were torn and shredded with their stomach organs hanging out, and it was just a shock to the researchers that they were still even alive. Most of the soldiers that were a part of helping these researchers were Russian special operatives, but still, many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects from that room. The remainder subjects in the room continued to scream to be left into that chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on. They were terrified to fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a pretty good fight as they were being removed from that room. Okay, now this is where it's gonna get gruesome. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out by one of the prisoners, and another was severely injured by having his testicles ripped off and his artery in his leg severed by one of the subjects biting him. Zombies? Man. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives if you count the ones that committed suicide in the weeks after the incident. In a struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he ended up bleeding out, and they tried to save him, and at the same time as he was bleeding out, he was still putting up a pretty good fight, but in the end he ended up dying. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begged to have the gas turned back on because they did not want to fall asleep. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that was in the facility. But as they were operating on him, he ended up closing his eyes to go to sleep, and he ended up dying. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had triple the normal levels of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to be restrained. The second survivor had been the first one who started screaming in the room. His vocal cords were destroyed. He was unable to beg or object to the surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. Then they tried to do the surgery without the anesthetics, and the subject didn't react to the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and putting them back inside of him and covering it up with the remainder skin that he had. One of the terrified nurses assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever her eyes met his. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to act as if he was trying to say something but couldn't talk. So the surgeon had gotten a pen and pad so that the subject could write on this and give him a message. And it was simple: keep cutting. Then the other 2 subjects were given the same surgery, but they wouldn't stop fighting, so they had to paralyze them so that they could operate on them. After the test subjects had their surgery, they would come out, and after they could be able to speak again or talk again, they would beg that they would put them back on the gas so that they could stay awake. They were so terrified that they were going to fall asleep and die. Then, after all of this was going on, the researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves and why they had ripped out their own guts and why did they want to be given the gas again. There was only one response given: I must remain awake. All three subjects' restraints were reinforced and they were placed back into the chamber awaiting determination as what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors, had failed their experiment project, even though the subjects were still somewhat alive. The commanding officer, a former KGB agent, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected to this, but in the end, they were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all three subjects stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going to be put back onto the gas. It was obvious that at this point all three were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute, who destroyed his vocal cords, was straining his legs against the leather bounds with his left leg and then his right leg just as he was trying to focus on something. Then the third subject was holding his head off his pillow, blinking rapidly. Most of the researchers were monitoring his brain waves and surprised they were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined unexpectedly. It looked as if he was repeatedly suffering from brain death before returning back to normal. As they were focusing on the paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut, and at the same moment his head hit the pillow, his brainwaves immediately changed to a deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time, and his heart ended up stopping. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed that the same flatlines as the one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside as well as the three researchers. One of the researchers grabbed his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. Then he ended up pointing his gun at the remaining subjects still restrained to his bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. I won't be locked in here with these things, and not with you, he screamed at this man strapped to this table. What are you? He demanded. I must know. So as this researcher is screaming to this test subject that is strapped down to this bed, and he said,
Have you forgotten so easily? We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralyze when you go to the nocturnal heaven where we cannot tread.
After this happened, the researcher paused and then aimed at the subject's heart and fired the gun. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out, and as he was dying, he said, "So nearly free." This was such a tragic event in time. Please let me know your thoughts below. Here's a little bit of history for you. Hit that thumbs up. Peace, I love you, and as always, God bless.